Mirrors by Greensearcher. Epilogue Part 3. It had been like reliving a dream. Excepting Adam's form, the night had been nearly identical to the one from before. Same candlelit dinner, same music, same dance alone across the grand ballroom floor. She even wore the same beautiful yellow gown, given to her by Queen Jacqueline, despite Belle's efforts to stop her, and Adam had somehow been fitted in another deep blue suit, like the one he'd worn in his cursed form.
Things were kind of ruined that night,
Adam had explained while proposing the idea,
so we're gonna make up for it.
It was wonderful and magical, bringing Belle back into another life yet again. Yet Adam seemed nervous, though perhaps that was just like the first time as well. They had been apart in the last few months. Perhaps that was it. Or perhaps he was worried something would go wrong again.
Do I still dance as well as I did then?
He asked, holding her close in the middle of the grand ballroom. The lights were dim like they had been before. That same beautiful melody drifting from the shadows. Almost as well, Belle teased. He laughed, though Belle still sensed something strange about his expression as he led her over to the balcony and down the old hidden steps. Olive stood waiting for them, as Belle knew that she would be, though this time Adam pulled himself into the saddle behind her before they took off towards Abel's Peak. "You're shaking," Belle observed quietly, reaching for his hand. "She won't show up. Not this time. She's gone." Adam smiled a little against her cheek, and, like the first time, he seemed aware of something she didn't.
I know.
The stars were as beautiful as she remembered, though they now revealed the bright summer constellations instead of those of deep winter. Still, Belle was distracted by the man beside her. Adam was fully grown once again, tall and broad, and warm against her back as they settled on the blanket in the grass. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, still trembling.
"I love you,"
he whispered. Belle leaned into him, soaking in his presence she had missed so much. "I love you too," she said easily. The words had become second nature by now, though no less meaningful. Adam sucked in a breath, tucking himself even closer to her.
"I wanted to say that then, but she stopped me."
"You were going to tell me that night?" Belle asked, surprised.
Yes, I'd planned to say something important then,"
he confessed. He paused, then went on carefully.
"Much like tonight."
Belle's breath caught in her throat, for suddenly she realised what was coming. The forest all around was still, the only sound a stream somewhere far below.
"Do you know what today's?"
he asked, voice gentle in her ear. Belle shook her head slowly. "What?" she breathed. He smiled a little, gazing out over the valley himself.
"It's the day we met,"
he explained. He turned then, and Belle sensed him looking at her.
"The first time."
He pulled away and stood, moving before her. Taking Belle's hands, he helped her to her feet, his back to the starry forest beyond. Then, eyes not leaving hers, he fell on one knee.
"I've tried for years to put this into words. I'll no doubt fail again, but I have to try."
He stopped, sucking in a breath.
"Belle, you are beautiful. And the beauty I see with my eyes is only the faintest fraction of what I mean. Your beauty is selfless. Your beauty is kind. Your beauty is brilliant and daring and wonderfully defiant,"
he said, a hint of amusement in his eyes. Belle laughed quietly, eyes shining.
"It's loving everything and everyone you see,"
he went on, sobering.
"Even a monster, who should have been unlovable."
Adam." He only gripped her hands harder, still quaking.
"That day you first came here, I'd spent the last 10 years in sorrow. This time I spent them in joy, because I was with you. He stopped, voice growing to a whisper. Spend the rest with me, Belle?
Belle smiled, heart bursting at the seams, and loving him all the more. For even now, even after everything, he had assumed nothing. She reached out, resting her hand on his cheek like she had done so long ago. You know I will.
We're married!
Belle laughed lightly. Adam had probably said that a dozen times that day. I know, she whispered in excitement, heart full, now tangled in Adam's arms in their private carriage, where they finally found themselves alone for the first time since speaking their vows. Belle grinned to herself and went on, and I'm a princess! Now it was Adam's turn to laugh.
Perhaps,
he said, quickly sobering as he pulled her even closer. His voice grew low.
But you're my queen.
If it weren't for the occasion, those words might have aroused a snort from Belle. Yet, as it was, they had only aroused other things. Adam had felt it proper, and Belle wise, to wait until this day before fully acting on such feelings. And so they had waited. If barely. As such, it was now highly unlikely they would last another 3-hour ride to their inn along the coast. As though thinking the same things, Adam pulled her even closer, breath hot against her ear.
We're married,
he said again, as though he still couldn't quite believe it.
Indeed you are, someone said suddenly. Congratulations.
Adam swore loudly, jumping at the sound of the voice and hitting his head on the carriage roof. For a tiny, wrinkled old woman now sat in the seat across from them. Nana! Belle cried in surprise, flushing violently.
Good God, Nana! We're on our honeymoon,
Adam said between gritted teeth, red-faced and flushed. Agatha only laughed.
Yes, but I had to deliver your wedding present, did I not?
But, Nana, we asked for no gifts, Belle insisted.
Really, Adam said impatiently. No need for a gift. At all.
Agatha only chuckled.
Oh, you'll want this one. Go on, open it up.
No, Adam asked reluctantly. Belle elbowed him lightly in the side. He sighed, taking the package and holding it between them as Belle untied the string. She unfolded the paper, revealing a wide volume. Turning back the covers, she saw an intricate, hand-painted map of the globe.
An atlas?
Adam asked. It's beautiful, Nana, Belle said politely, though she shared in Adam's confusion.
It's more than that,
Agatha said, chuckling at their perplexed expressions.
At first I considered giving you another enchanted mirror. But then I thought, simply seeing the places isn't nearly so fun as going to them, is it?
Adam blinked. Then his eyes grew wide. He looked from Agatha to the book to Agatha again.
Nana, are you serious? He gawked.
Agatha merely grinned.
Now, you could still journey to Piccadilly this evening, if you wish. But there is another place waiting for you. Here,
she said, placing one wrinkled finger on a spot near the other Grand Ocean, just inland of China's coast. Belle and Adam glanced at each other. She was smiling eagerly, and a grin swept over his own face. Turning back to the book, Belle placed her fingers on the enchanted page. At her touch, it began to glow. Adam's hand quickly reached for her own, fingers winding together. The light grew twofold, and in an instant they vanished. Belle stood barefoot, fingers held out and just barely brushing the silk curtains before her. Gentle evening winds flitted through them, the only barrier between the balcony beyond and their room behind her. Their room. She looked back over the matted floors behind her, at the beautiful lamps casting a violet glow over the room. Towards the low bed, surrounded by a pale golden canopy, lying at the chamber's centre. Belle felt her cheeks flush. Her heart began to flutter in anticipation. suddenly anxious to step into the warm night air in nothing but a thin, shimmering chemise. Yet, at the same time, wanting nothing more than to feel his warmth seep through it. A gust of wind pushed the curtains aside, and for a moment she saw him. Leaning against the railing, Adam stood wearing a loose linen shirt and his breeches, his own bare feet against the cool, tiled ground. It reminded Belle of the first time she had seen him without the curse, and she smiled as she followed his gaze into the city below. Red and orange lights dotted the landscape, some moving peacefully through the streets, others painting immobile colours in the sky. The sky from the other side of the world.
Belle?
She looked back, realizing he had spotted her. Heart racing anew, Belle slipped past the curtains, stepping shyly to his side. Adam watched her come, unblinking. He had never been one to let his eyes wander, but tonight she wished it to. And it did. His eyes falling over her form, slowly, carefully, passionately. She approached him, and he reached quickly for her hands, leaning his head down to rest on her own.
You are so beautiful,
he whispered, hot and deep. Belle felt a gentle blush cross her cheeks, and she stepped closer, aching for his warmth. His hands released hers and drew her against him, the fabric of her chemise doing little to stop his heat from flaring against her skin. At the moment, however, something crinkled between them. Belle pulled back just enough to open her eyes and stare down at the corner of parchment sticking out from his shirt pocket. Adam looked down, as if remembering it was there. He slipped it out and set it on the balcony ledge, bringing his hand up back to tuck at the strand of hair behind Belle's ear.
A note from Agatha, he whispered, distracted.
What did it say? Belle asked, half distracted herself as he wove his fingers through her hair and kissed her forehead.
To watch the sky,
he said, pressing his palm to her cheek and kissing the other before going on.
But I just was, and I didn't see.
A flash of light and a distant boom that shook them to the centre. Belle looked up in an instant, afraid for but a moment it took to find the source. She gasped, eyes wide and filled with bright red and golden light. Those are... Another wave of booms reached them, belated and dulled in the warm air.
Fireworks,
Adam finished for her. He laughed quietly, then, a wide smile betraying his own delight at the sight.
I can't believe she remembered.
The lights were far off, only soft, distant rumbles, like deep drums sounding from the horizon. They brightened the sky in bursts, raining over the horizon and filling Belle's heart with a kind of magic even she had never experienced. Of course, there was a different kind of magic to experience tonight. Adam lifted his lips to her ear.
I love you, Belle,
he whispered, voice shaking.
I love you so much.
She turned, reaching up to hold his face in her hands. Then, raising herself on her toes, she kissed him in such a way that left no doubt that she loved him back. His fingers gathered up the thin fabric at her back, pulling her in with a sudden desperation. As her knees grew weak, he crouched down, lifting her into his arms without breaking the kiss. Nothing left to fear. Belle huffed a strand of hair from her eyes, unable to reach it at her current state. No less than 12 pillows had been stuffed all around her at Mrs. Potts' insistence, propping up her back and knees and leaving her sufficiently immobilized. Belle just managed to wiggle a couple of fingers free so that she could turn the page of her book, now propped against her bulging stomach. She sighed, feeling silly. Silly and bored. A faint click rang out from the far end of the room, breaking Belle from her thoughts. She grinned as the figure slowly approached, glancing around quickly before slipping beneath the covers. Adam wasn't supposed to see her during her confinement, after all. Which, of course, was the most ridiculous rule she could ever fathom. And ridiculous rules were just made to be broken.
What in the... Where are you?
He whispered. Belle laughed, managing to tug a couple of pillows away so that he could reach her. As soon as he did, he kissed her deeply, leaving Belle a little breathless when he finally pulled back and nestled against her side. One large hand found her stomach a moment later, warm against the fabric.
Any more kicking today?
He asked, eager. Belle sighed, needing a sore spot beneath the bulge. Plenty, I can assure you. He hummed, rubbing his thumb in circles over her skin.
Baby, you must be gentle on Mamma,
he said. As he said it, she felt the child move inside her. Adam perked up, spreading his fingers wide and feeling the small bump moving about beneath.
Do you think they know I'm here?
He wondered, turning back to her. Mm-hmm, she replied. They're starting to know your voice, it seems. Adam smiled wide, waiting until the movement calmed before shifting back up to his wife's side. He weaved one arm around her shoulders, pressing his cheek against her hair.
I miss you,
he breathed. I miss you too, she said in earnest, hugging him back as tightly as she could manage. It's barely been a week of this, and I'm already bored out of my mind. In response, Adam pulled back, reaching into his pocket to offer up a small novel he had brought along. She sighed, though she took it eagerly. This is truly ridiculous, she said, knowing that she had been whining about this for the last week, but unable to stop herself. My mother was working our fields the days before I was born, and with Eloise she went into labour during her morning classes.
Your mother isn't a princess, Adam noted.
Belle blanched, indignant. That shouldn't... She stopped quickly, noticing the smirk on Adam's face. You're teasing me.
Yes, he admitted, chuckling. I'm sorry though, but Dr. Mathias is hard to argue over such matters with. I've tried.
Belle fell back into her mountain of pillows, huffing a bit of hair from her eyes. He underestimates me.
Absolutely,
Adam agreed. I mean, I admit taking Philippe for a ride last week was a little much, but I could at least walk the grounds. I would be perfectly fine.
Of course you would.
Feeling more placated than before, Belle smiled once again. She glanced around the dark room, noticing a half-dozen large canvases leaning against the walls and furniture. Most were nearly complete. Still, I'm getting plenty done as it is, she said proudly. Adam smiled, then asked her about her progress. She answered readily, nestling closer as they spoke of their respective days, and fell easily into the familiarity they had felt all these years.
Remember when I used to do this?
He soon asked.
Sneak into your room past midnight back when we were teenagers.
Belle grinned, glancing back at the hidden passage across the room. Hush! That never happened. He snickered, but only went on. Leaning closer, he could whisper,
Shall we do what we did then?
Brightening, Belle finally gave in, turning towards him and smiling ear to ear.
Just so you know, Dr. Mathias would murder me if he found you out here.
Belle was still smiling, staring up at the night sky above. A few clouds flitted by, but she could still make out most of the constellations from where they sat along the low-levelled rooftop just outside her bedroom. Dr. Mathias can fight me. Adam snorted quietly, no doubt already used to pregnancy's tendency to make his wife a little more feisty than usual.
I think that's on his list of things you must avoid, he teased.
I despise that list, she said, smirking. Soon, however, she sobered. Are you sure you'll be all right? She asked him. When the baby comes, she clarified. You tend to worry, is all, she explained delicately. Adam raised a brow.
You mean I overreact to everything?
He deadpanned. That's not what I said, she replied, hiding a smile. He puffed, waving it off.
I'm past all that,
he said casually, pulling her close again and staring back at the stars.
I'll be fine. Thump, thump, thump. Mrs. Potts!
A muffled voice called out from the other side. Prince Adam's voice by the sound of it. Dawn was barely creeping through the shutters in the dim bedroom, and a young woman groaned in pain. I'm sorry, Belle panted a moment later, sweat painting her brow. You cry all you wish, Soleil said, squeezing her hand. All you wish, sweetheart. Belle nodded, arms beginning to quake where they propped her up. Another push now, Mrs. Potts said, Sophie wringing out a cloth at her side.
I know it's hard, but just remember that beautiful babe you'll have when we're through,
Tears pooled in the corners of Belle's eyes, but she nodded again, and with the effort she cried out.
Thump, thump, thump! Mrs. Potts!
The prince cried again, high and frantic.
You let me in, or I'll...
He fell quiet for a moment, and then,
I'll break down the door!
At that, Belle's 3 companions broke into chuckles. Poor man, her mother said. If he's anything like Maurice, he'll have worn a hole in the floor by now. Mrs. Potts, Belle gasped, looking up at the older woman where she stood. She panted for a moment, then went on. Can't he come in? She frowned.
I'm sorry, love, but this is no place for a man.
Please, Belle stopped, grimacing against a fresh wave of pain. She made it through, swallowing as more sweat ran down her brow. I admit I've been wishing he could. Mrs. Potts watched the poor girl for a moment. The one who had rarely asked for such a thing all these years, and now in her greatest pain only wished to have her sweetheart at her side. And she thought of her own daughter, who had been without her own in her own labours, in her final moments. Belle seemed far from such a danger herself, but Mrs. Potts now couldn't help but see a bit of Virginie in her eyes. She sighed. All right, love, all right. Leaving Belle in the care of Sophie and her mother, Mrs. Potts moved with a swift step to the door of the room. Prince Adam was pacing the hall. His hair was a mess against his shoulders, as though he'd been running a nervous hand through it all night. And he seemed to be covered in nearly as much sweat as his wife. At the click of the door, his head whipped around and he raced towards the room. Mrs. Potts, however, held a firm hand against the door, blocking his way. Now, my prince, you must understand one thing, she said firmly. When you step into that room, your title goes out of the window, for I am in charge here. Do I make myself clear? He blinked in surprise, but quickly nodded, then glanced over her shoulder, nervous, eyes trying to catch sight of his young wife in the room. And if you cannot keep your fears in check, you can march yourself right back out of these doors, Mrs. Potts continued. It will do her no good to have you in a panic. He looked down at her then, expression sombre.
Yes, Mrs. Potts, I understand.
At her nod, he bolted past her and into the room. Soleil made to move away from Belle's side, but Adam only crawled across the opposite side of the bed to reach her. She reached for him with a shaky hand, and he caught it quickly, reaching an arm around her in support. Belle rested her head against his chest, eyes closing with momentary relief. All right, love, Mrs. Potts said carefully, moving back in place. Can you give me another push? Belle opened her eyes again, feeling stronger than before. I can. Another hour passed, and dawn now filled the room with light as the child's first cries. The infant was placed in its mother's arms while Adam cradled her in his own. A boy, Sophie whispered happily, turning back to help Mrs. Potts with the afterbirth. Belle gazed down at him, all the pain from before replaced by relief and joy. Adam reached for her face, kissing her temple for a long moment, before reaching down and softly touching his son's cheek. His son, whose name had been destined long ago atop a nearby peak.
Hello, Abel.
A princess sat in her bed, sinking into the soft covers as she held a novel in her lap. A warm summer's evening, her day spent juggling a toddler while trying to complete her most recent commission. Another mural hung over the bed where she now sat, one that would never be sold. It depicted a wide valley bowl, with a shining lake at the centre, and a rocky peak, where only one who knew to look might spot a giant creature, sitting beside a young woman as they gazed over the view. Adam had stood in the doorway, silent, watching Belle read. It was a sight he hadn't yet tired of, nor could he imagine he ever would. Not with the faint smile that would cross her lips at times, or the way she would pause and press the book to her chest as she pondered a particularly poignant theme. Perhaps the only sight that proved better was watching her read to Abel, curled up together by the warmth of an evening fire. She still hadn't noticed him in there, so he moved quietly across the room. He settled on the end of the bed, cocking his head at her. Just wanted to finish this chapter before bed, Belle said, eyes not leaving the page. The corner of Adam's mouth curled up in amusement. No, some things never changed. Still, she only tempted him. He let the back of one finger brush up her leg.
Might I help you moving your stockings tonight, my love?
He asked casually. She finally looked up at him then, a knowing look in her eye as she raised a brow. Still, she didn't object, so he let his finger slip beneath the top of the fabric, pulling it down but an inch. Then he leaned down, brushing his lips against the skin of her inner thigh. Belle shuddered. The book fell but a fraction. Papa, what are you doing? Adam froze. Then, slowly, he looked up. A little boy stood there in a wrinkled nightshirt, one stocking missing and a worn stuffed bear held tight in his arms.
Ah, Abel,
Adam said, flustered, pulling back in an instant and patting Belle's leg awkwardly.
I was just,
He looked at her for help and quickly realised none would be found. For Belle currently had her own face pressed between the pages of her book once again, shoulders trembling in silent laughter.
Traitor,
he thought, looking back quickly at their young son and beginning to sweat.
But then he had an idea. Mamma had an owie, he said, raising a finger, and I was kissing it better.
Belle's silent amusement was now betrayed by a short, high-pitched laugh, which she only barely managed to stifle once again. The book slipped from her fingers, cheeks flushed underneath, and eyes dancing with mirth as they glanced around him. Oh no! Abel said, entirely unaware of his parents' amusement. Mamma, are you better now? Belle's expression softened, though her eyes were still full of laughter. Such a sweetheart, she cooed, reaching out and resting a hand against the child's cheek. Yes, I'm all better. Abel reached 2 arms out, and Belle complied, lifting him from the floor and into her lap. He curled himself against her chest, closing his eyes and smiling happily. Adam only sighed.
Buddy,
he said, moving over and resting his own hand on Belle's shoulder. He reached out, ruffling Abel's already messy hair.
If you want that little sister you keep talking about, you're going to have to learn to stay in bed.
Belle smirked, glancing over at him. You know, she whispered, I believe there may be one on the way already. Adam blinked, then his eyes grew wide, flitting to her abdomen and back to her in a moment. His mouth fell open. I was going to give it a few more days, she went on quietly, Abel's breathing already falling into a gentle rhythm of sleep. But I'm quite certain as it is.
Wow,
Adam breathed in shock.
I'm
not ready for this again? He smiled, then shook his head.
No, I'm just happy,
he said honestly.
Really happy.
Belle appeared to release a breath she was holding, smiling back at him. He reached up, holding her face in his palm and kissing her for a long, drawn-out moment. Then he reached down and took Abel from her arms to return him to his own bed. He caught Belle reach for the book once more as he left the room, and chuckled under his breath. Abel's room was just down the hall, and he moved carefully but swiftly, anxious to return to Belle's warmth. Reaching the small bed, Adam turned and pressed a quick kiss to the boy's cheek.
Good night, Abel, he whispered. I love you.
Yet, as he leaned over the mattress to tuck the child in, Abel's grip tightened, his little face bearing itself further against Adam's neck. Papa, he said frantically, voice muffled. Don't go. I'm scared. Adam hesitated, then straightened again, holding Abel closer than before.
What are you scared of?
He asked quietly. He felt a bit of discomfort in his stomach, but went on.
Monsters?
No, Abel said, pulling back and looking at his father with furrowed brows. Monsters are nice. Mama told me.
Adam couldn't help but smile at that. Ah, I see. What then?
Glancing around the room, Abel leaned close to Adam's ear, covering it with one small hand as he whispered, Papa Noel.
Adam blinked. Papa Noel?
The boy nodded in earnest. He can get inside, even when we lock the windows, he said, eyes growing wide. It's scary. Adam opened his mouth to reply, but closed it again. The kid had a point.
Don't worry,
he said instead, an idea forming in his mind that left him barely suppressing a grin.
I'll talk to Papa Noel and tell him to leave his gifts outside. Mama and I can put them out instead, okay?
Okay, Abel agreed, sighing and resting back against his shoulder. Chuckling quietly, Adam moved towards the little balcony window, looking out over the gardens below. They were white with fresh snow, blending into the trees and hills beyond. He stared out at the scene, pondering what lay beyond. Their kingdom, peaceful and prosperous, and their people, happy and free. He had already begun to see the effort it took to make it that way, but he also witnessed what happened when that effort wasn't given, and that knowledge empowered him. Feeling thoughtful, Adam turned back, repositioning Abel in his arms as his eyes moved slowly over the dark room. A small oil lamp sat atop the fireplace mantel, left burning low and casting warm orange shadows over the room. The walls were covered with friendly figures, smiling teacups, playful candlesticks, a dancing suit of armour, painted lovingly by the child's mother. Adam looked at the work of Belle's hands, at the books and soft plush animals scattered over the floor, back to the child in his arms, the small, breathing creation of their love. It was too much. Adam felt his throat grow tight in an instant, the simple beauty of it all rushing over him like floodwaves and threatening to spill out. A hand on his arm. Adam, someone asked softly, what's wrong? He looked over. Belle was beside him. He hadn't even heard her enter, looking at him with concern. He must have lingered here longer than he realized.
Nothing,
he answered a bit sheepishly, lifting a shoulder to dab his wet eyes.
Just, well, being a papa has turned me into a blubbering fool, it seems.
Belle laughed softly, moving her arm through his and leaning against his shoulder. He shifted Abel to one arm, wrapping the other around her, staring back out the window at the dark night sky. He can get inside, even when we lock the windows. Abel's frightened voice, echoing in the back of his mind. Adam frowned. Perhaps Papa Noel didn't pose any threat, but he knew far too well of those who could get past locked windows and guarded doors. And suddenly the darkness outside seemed to creep back into his heart once more. Memories of red eyes, of fluid mirrors and a thick swirling mist. An old, buried fear. A fear that everyone he loved would somehow be taken from him once again. He pulled Abel closer, the arm holding Belle starting to tremble.
Can I really be happy? He asked quietly. Can this, all of this, can it really last?
She looked back up at him, eyes growing soft. It can.
But how can you know?
He whispered, almost desperate for her answer. I can feel it, she said in earnest. She paused, however, looking somewhat impish. That, and, well, I may have had Agatha look ahead for me. Adam raised his brows.
Really?
She smiled. She said there's nothing to fear. A few bumps in the road, of course, and more than a few surprises, but nothing left to fear. Adam's chest swelled in relief. He pulled Belle close, kissing her softly in the darkness. A darkness that, for the first time, offered nothing but serenity and peace. It was a tale as old as time, he supposed. A man who loved his wife with all he was. A young father overwhelmed from the joy brought by his child. For he certainly wasn't the only one. Yet, at the same time, Adam couldn't imagine another soul possibly feeling the same joy he felt in this very moment. And he knew no one had come to their own happiness in the way he had. He pulled back then, heart too full for words, gazing at the face of the woman he adored, at the friend who had saved him from despair, at the beauty who had loved a beast. The end. Hi guys, end of story. Thank you so much for joining me on this. I wanted to do this one since I started my channel, but I wanted to get in some proper practice before I got it all done. And I'm so happy with how it turned out. I actually listen back to my own chapters a lot because to me this doesn't sound like the voice I use when I talk. I guess that's a universal thing, isn't it? We sound different when we hear ourselves recorded. So to me it's just one of my favourite stories being told again. And oh my god, can I just say, they named their son Abel after the peak where they became friends. Are you kidding me? That's the perfect little cherry on top of the cake. I'm loving that. And I love all of this. Oh my days. And the fact that he chose the day that they met in the original timeline to recreate the Beauty and the Beast sequence and tell her he loves her on Abel's peak, uninterrupted, and uses that night to propose. I mean, geez, give the man a medal for being a romantic. I am very much impressed. Anyway, yes, I'm going to cut it short here. So, well, I say cut it short. I'm going to end it here, okay? So you guys know the drill. Like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care, okay? Bye!